There is an archetype that haunts the collective memory of humankind, a primordial narrative that echoes in the deepest chambers of our past, a story of divine wrath, of a world judged unworthy and washed clean by water, and of a chosen few who survived the apocalypse to begin anew. For billions of people alive today, this story has one name: Noah, a righteous man, a colossal ark, a covenant from God sealed with a rainbow. It's a cornerstone of faith, a foundational myth so deeply embedded in our culture, we feel we know it in our bones. But what if I told you that story is an echo, a powerful retelling, yes, but not the original? What if I told you that a full millennium before the first words of Genesis were ever penned, this same epic tale of survival was already ancient history, inscribed not on parchment, but baked into clay tablets in the heart of ancient Mesopotamia? This is a story from a lost world of feuding gods and legendary heroes, buried for millennia beneath the sands of what is now Iraq. It speaks not of Noah, but of a king from the city of Shirapak, a man who wasn't just saved, but was granted the one thing the gods jealously guard for themselves: immortality. This is the tale of Utnapishtim.
Welcome to Secrets of the Ancients, where ancient mysteries awaken.
To understand this story, you first have to understand the world that dreamed it into being. You have to travel back in your mind, not just in time, but in landscape, to a place the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. But to the people who lived there, it was simply the land, or Kalem in the tongue of its earliest architects. Forget the world you know. Erase the neat borders on modern maps, the predictable seasons, the sense of cosmic order we take for granted. You have to imagine a world that was both a garden and a crucible, a place of terrifying, beautiful, and violent paradox. The stage for our story is a vast, flat, alluvial plain, carved out of the surrounding deserts by two powerful, temperamental life-givers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. These weren't gentle, predictable rivers like the Nile, which blessed Egypt with a reliable, life-affirming rhythm. No, the Mesopotamian rivers were wild, chaotic, and prone to flash floods of apocalyptic violence. They could deliver the rich silt that made the land fantastically fertile, allowing for the birth of cities where none should have existed. But in the spring, swollen with snowmelt from the distant mountains of Anatolia, they could rise without warning and sweep away entire settlements, returning the works of humanity to a primordial state of mud and water. This duality, life and death flowing in the very same currents, was baked into the Mesopotamian soul. They lived in a constant, low-grade state of anxiety, keenly aware that their entire civilization existed on a knife's edge, a fragile bargain struck with immense, indifferent forces. Their world was open and exposed, lying naked under a vast, oppressive sky. There were no natural mountain barriers to protect them from invaders, no dense forests to hide in. There was only the sun, the mud, the reeds, and the overwhelming presence of the gods. And it was in this crucible of anxiety and ingenuity that the first true civilization on planet Earth was hammered into existence. The story begins with a people who appear on this stage as if from nowhere: the Sumerians, an enigmatic, non-Semitic people. Their language is a linguistic isolate, related to no other known tongue on Earth. Yet, from this mysterious origin, they gifted humanity with a blueprint for civilization. They gave us the wheel, the sail, the 60-second minute, and the 60-minute hour. They gave us law codes, monumental architecture, and the complex bureaucracy needed to manage a city. But their most profound invention, the one that allows us to hear their voices today, was writing. On humble tablets of wet river clay, they used sharpened reeds to impress wedge-shaped marks, a system we call cuneiform. And with it, they didn't just track shipments of barley and livestock. They wrote down their soul. They documented their fears, their praises, their philosophies, and their myths. They turned ephemeral speech into an artifact that could outlast empires. And what a world they documented. The Sumerian mind did not see a universe of mindless, physical laws. They saw a cosmos teeming with divine will, with personality, with intention. Their world was alive, and it was run by a pantheon of gods who were every bit as volatile and unpredictable as the Mesopotamian rivers. These weren't the distant, perfect, all-loving deities of later monotheistic traditions. The Mesopotamian gods were breathtakingly human in their flaws. They were driven by lust, jealousy, ambition, and petty grievance. They quarreled, they schemed, and they made catastrophic mistakes. At the head of this divine assembly was Anu, the remote god of the heavens, often too aloof to be bothered with human affairs. The real power on earth belonged to his son, Enlil, the god of wind, storm, and the word. Enlil was the divine enforcer, the lord of command, a figure of immense power but also of terrible, capricious wrath. It was his roar you heard in the howling storm, his fury you felt when the floodwaters rose. And then there was Enki, known to the later Babylonians as E. He was the trickster god, the lord of wisdom, magic, and the sweet waters that flowed in the abyss beneath the earth. While Enlil was the hammer, Enki was the mind. A clever and often compassionate figure who was seen as the great friend and benefactor of humankind. This divine tension between the harsh judgment of Enlil and the cunning compassion of Enki forms the central dramatic axis of much of their mythology, and it is absolutely critical to the story of the Great Flood. In the Mesopotamian worldview, humanity was not the crown of creation. We were an afterthought. The myths tell of a time when only the gods existed, and the younger, junior gods were forced to perform all the back-breaking labor, digging the canals, maintaining the earth. After centuries of toil, they went on strike, burning their tools and surrounding Enlil's temple, demanding relief. It was the clever Enki who proposed a solution: create a lesser being, a primitive worker, to take over the labor so the gods could rest. And so humanity was fashioned from clay, mixed with the blood of a slain god, and brought to life for a single, servile purpose: to dig the ditches, harvest the grain, and most importantly, to provide a steady stream of sacrificial food and drink to nourish the gods. Our existence was purely functional. We were the help, and this fundamental concept explains the shocking casualness with which the gods could later decide to exterminate us. When you fire a worker, you don't typically feel cosmic guilt. This precarious existence was lived in the shadow of a bleak understanding of the afterlife. There was no heaven, no paradise awaiting the virtuous. All souls, whether king or commoner, descended to the same place, the Kur, the land of no return. It was a dreary, subterranean realm of dust and shadows, a gray, silent underworld where the dead ate dust and drank clay, forever thirsting for the fresh water of the living. This profound existential dread, this belief that this life is all there is, fueled a desperate search for meaning, fame, and a way to cheat death. It is out of this very worldview, this entire psychological, geographical, and spiritual matrix, that the world's first great work of literature arises: the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of a legendary Sumerian king of the city of Uruk, 2/3 god and 1/3 man, who is forced to confront the one enemy he cannot defeat: his own mortality. In his desperate quest to find the secret of eternal life, Gilgamesh journeys to the ends of the earth to find the only human ever to have escaped death's grasp. This is where our two stories converge. For the man he seeks is none other than the ancient survivor of the Great Flood, a man who lives in a paradise called Dilmun, far from the world of mortals, a man named Utnapishtim. And it is from the mouth of this lone immortal that Gilgamesh, and by extension the entire world, first learns the secret, terrifying history of how the gods tried to wipe the slate clean, and how one man, with the help of a rebel god, saved the seed of life in a great boat. This story within a story, preserved on tablet Roman 11 of the great epic, is not just a myth. It is presented as a hidden history, a survivor's testimony, a chilling memory from a time before our own. As Gilgamesh sits, captivated at the edge of the world, the immortal Utnapishtim begins his tale. And his story starts not with rain, not with a boat, but in the silent, terrifying chambers of heaven, at a secret council of the great gods. He asks Gilgamesh to imagine the world in its prime, when humanity, the gods' own creation, had succeeded beyond all expectation. The cities were teeming, the fields were fertile. But this success came with a consequence the gods had never anticipated. Humanity was loud. This is the hinge upon which the entire catastrophe turns, and it is here that the Mesopotamian worldview reveals itself to be so profoundly alien to our own. The reason for the annihilation of mankind was not, as later traditions would hold, a matter of moral corruption, of sin, or of wickedness. The crime that condemned the world was noise. The original Akkadian text uses the word rigmu, a clamor, an uproar, a constant grating din. The vibrancy of human life, their conversations, their work, their arguments, their laughter, their prayers, all of it ascended to the heavens and began to grate on the nerves of the most powerful and short-tempered god of the pantheon, Enlil, lord of wind and storm. The text is chillingly specific. The land had grown wide, the people had multiplied, the land was bellowing like a wild bull. This wasn't a sin to be punished, it was a nuisance to be eliminated. Enlil, whose divine prerogative was rest and tranquility, found himself unable to sleep. Think of it, the supreme being of the Mesopotamian cosmos, the divine executor, is kept awake by the sound of his creations living. This seemingly trivial complaint is one of the most terrifying concepts in ancient theology. It reveals a universe where humanity's very existence is conditional, and where our survival depends on the whims and the sleep schedule of a grumpy, omnipotent deity. The relationship isn't one of a shepherd to a flock, but of a master to a workshop, and the tools had become unbearably loud. This wasn't a rash decision. Other older versions of this story, like the magnificent Epic of Atrahasis, show us that the flood was Enlil's third and final attempt at population control. He had first unleashed a plague, but the wise god Enki, or E, had subverted him, instructing the people on how to perform specific rituals that would appease the god of disease. The plague receded. Annoyed, Enlil then unleashed a crippling drought and famine, locking the rains in the sky and barring the fertility of the land. Once again, E intervened, teaching humanity how to manage their resources and survive. Enlil's frustration grew into a cold, absolute fury. His targeted solutions had failed because of his brother's meddling. This time, he would devise a plan that was total, inescapable, and secret. He convened the great gods in their sacred assembly at Shuruppak. Anu, the Sky Father, was there. Ninurta, the fearsome god of war and the hunt, was there. Ennugi, the inspector of canals, was there. And of course, the wise and cunning E. In that council, Enlil declared his final solution, a great flood, the Abubu, a deluge that would scour the face of the earth and wipe the slate clean. He would unbar the gates of heaven and heave open the floodgates of the abyss below, returning the world to the primordial watery chaos from which it was born. There would be no escape, and to ensure his plan would not be subverted a third time, Enlil enacted a masterstroke of divine politics. He made every single god in the assembly swear a sacred, unbreakable oath of secrecy. They were to be complicit in the silence. No one was to warn humanity. No one was to breathe a word of the coming doom. They all swore the oath, even E. The text implies they did so under duress, bound by the sheer force of Enlil's authority. The fate of the world was sealed in a divine conspiracy, but E was trapped. He was the co-creator of humanity. He was their divine patron, the god of wisdom who delighted in the cleverness of his creations. To stand by and watch them be senselessly annihilated was a violation of his very nature. Yet to break a sacred oath sworn in the divine assembly was an unthinkable betrayal, an act that could shatter the cosmic order. His dilemma was absolute. He was bound by law, but compelled by conscience. So the god of cunning devised a loophole. The oath forbade him from speaking of the plan to any human. It said nothing about speaking to a wall, and so the focus of this cosmic drama narrows from the heavens to a single point on earth, a man named Utnapishtim in his home city of Shuruppak. Utnapishtim was a king, a man of wealth and standing, but more importantly, he was known to be exceedingly devout and wise. A faithful worshipper of the god E, he was the perfect candidate. One night as Utnapishtim slept in his house, a simple structure, not of stone, but of woven reeds plastered with mud, typical of the riverlands, he was visited by a presence. The god E had come down from the heavens and positioned himself on the other side of the reed wall. He did not appear to Utnapishtim in a vision. He did not speak into his mind. He spoke to the wall. The text is wonderfully, bizarrely specific, turning a legalistic trick into a moment of profound mystery. Utnapishtim would have heard a disembodied voice, seemingly emanating from the very fabric of his own home, a voice both muffled and divine. The god began his oracle, not with a greeting, but with an urgent, cryptic command to the structure itself. reed hut, wall, reed hut, hearken, wall, pay attention. It is a message encoded in a warning to an inanimate object through the barrier of the wall. E reveals the god's secret plan, lamenting the terrible decision made by Enlil. And then he gives Utnapishtim a direct, world-altering command. It is a call to radical, seemingly insane action. Man of Shuruppak, son of Ubaratudu, the voice commanded through the reeds, tear down your house and build a boat, forsake your possessions and seek life, spurn your property and save your life. This was not a gentle suggestion. It was a divine order to abandon everything the civilized world valued: wealth, status, property, home. He was being told to liquidate his entire existence, to turn his back on the settled world of the city, and to undertake a project that would make him a madman in the eyes of his neighbors, all based on a whisper in the dark from a rebel god. Utnapishtim is left reeling in his reed hut, the divine whisper still echoing in the woven walls. The command is absolute, the stakes are cosmic, but the immediate reality is paralyzingly human. He is a king, a man of substance and reputation in a thriving city, and he has just been ordered to commit an act of spectacular public madness. He is to tear down his own house, his symbol of stability and status, and build a colossal boat on dry land. Far from any navigable sea, the command to forsake possessions and spurn property is a call to invert the very meaning of a successful life in Mesopotamian society. He doesn't simply obey like a mindless automaton. His first response, as recorded in the epic, is not one of fear, but of profound and practical concern. It is the question of a leader, a man who understands society. He opens his mouth and speaks back to the god, his voice cutting through the darkness of his home. "My lord," he says, "the command that you have just spoken, I have understood it, and I will honor it. But what shall I say to the city? What shall I tell the common folk, and what shall I tell the elders?" This is a moment of pure genius in the ancient narrative. Utnapishtim's question grounds the myth in a bedrock of social reality. He knows he cannot undertake this bizarre project in a vacuum. He will be seen, questioned, mocked, and judged. He needs a script. He needs a cover story. And E, the master of cunning, provides one. It is a masterpiece of deception, a lie layered with cruel, tragic irony. Because E is still bound by his oath, he cannot allow Utnapishtim to reveal the truth. To do so would expose his own divine treason and alert Enlil. So he concocts a story that will not only protect Utnapishtim's secret, but will also explain his actions and ensure he gets the help he needs to build the boat. He instructs Utnapishtim to tell his people this: "I have learned that the great god Enlil is hostile to me. Therefore, I can no longer reside in your city, nor can I even set my foot on Enlil's territory again. I must go down to the Apsu, the great abyss of fresh water below the earth, to live with my lord and patron, E." It's a perfect lie. It explains his departure, and it cleverly shifts the divine wrath from a global threat to a personal vendetta. But the next part of the deception is where the true cruelty lies. He tells Utnapishtim to promise the people of Shuruppak that once he, the object of Enlil's anger, is gone, the city will be showered with divine favor. He is to tell his doomed neighbors, "He will rain down upon you a shower of riches, a profusion of birds, a basketful of the rarest fish. The land will be blessed with a harvest of wealth." So Utnapishtim, his heart heavy with the terrible truth, must become the bearer of false hope. He has to watch his people, his friends, his subjects celebrate his departure, believing it will usher in an era of unprecedented prosperity, all while he builds the very instrument of his escape from their shared annihilation. He is forced into a position of profound psychological torment, a lonely conspirator with a rebel god, presiding over the unwitting last days of his world. Armed with this divine deception, Utnapishtim acts. He gathers the elders and the people and delivers the speech E gave him. And just as the god predicted, they believe him. They don't see a madman, they see a pious king making a noble sacrifice. And so the construction begins. This is not the humble, family-built ark of the later Genesis tradition. This is a massive, state-sponsored engineering project, undertaken with the full resources of a city. Utnapishtim throws open his coffers. He He has bullocks and sheep slaughtered every single day to feed the army of workers. He provides them with vats of beer, oil, and wine, dispensing them, as the epic says, like river water, as if for a great New Year's festival. A bizarre, carnivalesque atmosphere descends upon the project, a frantic celebration masking a funereal purpose. And the design of the vessel itself is deeply symbolic. E's instructions are precise. The boat is to be a perfect cube. Its ground plan is to be 1 iku, a standard surface measure of a field. And its walls are to rise to an equal height. This gargantuan, symmetrical shape is profoundly significant. A cube is not designed for speed or navigation. It is not meant to sail to a destination. It is designed for one purpose: stability. It is a vessel meant to endure, to tumble and spin in the chaos of a world-destroying deluge and remain intact. It is less a boat and more a floating, self-contained world, a microcosm of civilization sealed against the void. It's a mobile ziggurat, a floating temple. The interior is to be divided into 7 decks, and each deck is further partitioned into 9 sections, creating a complex honeycomb of compartments. The numbers are not accidental. 7 is a number of immense magical and religious power in Mesopotamia, the number of the primary celestial bodies, the number of gates to the underworld. The structure is a sacred architectural diagram, a machine for survival built according to divine mathematics. The epic describes the frenzied pace of the work. The poor carry baskets of bitumen, the natural sticky asphalt that was Mesopotamia's perfect waterproofing agent. The rich bring the other materials. The children fetch the wood. On the 5th day, the massive frame is laid out. By the 7th day, the impossible structure is complete. Utnapishtim himself, the king, participates in the work, personally loading 10,000-gallon containers of bitumen into the furnace and overseeing the caulking of the hull, both inside and out. Then comes the final, solemn act, the loading of the ark. First, Utnapishtim loads all of his silver and all of his gold, his entire fortune. Unlike the biblical narrative, possessions are not spurned. The material foundations of wealth are preserved. Next, he brings aboard his family, his wife, his relatives, his entire kin. Then comes the most telling detail, the one that reveals the core of the Mesopotamian survival plan. He loads aboard not just the seed of all living things, the beasts of the field, both wild and tame, but also specifically all the craftsmen, the shipwrights, the smiths, the potters, the weavers. This is the crucial difference. Utnapishtim is commanded to save not just biology, but technology, not just life, but civilization. He is preserving the knowledge, the skills, the human ingenuity required to rebuild a world from scratch. He is saving the very fabric of culture. Finally, as the moment approaches and the sky begins to show an ominous change, he brings aboard the last man, a boatman named Puser-Ramari. To this man, he entrusts the great vessel, the palace, with all its contents. Then Utnapishtim himself enters, and at the command of the sun god Shamash, who sets the appointed time, the door is sealed. Puser-Ramari pulls the great wooden bar across and seals it with bitumen from the inside. Utnapishtim, the king of Shuruppak, is now a prisoner in his own creation, floating in a city of the damned, waiting for the first drops of the rain that he knows will dissolve the world. The bitumen is sealed, the great bar is thrown across the door, and inside the colossal 7-decked cube there is a sudden, profound silence. For Utnapishtim and the precious cargo of life he carries, the world is now reduced to the scent of gopher wood, the nervous breath of animals, and the dim light filtering through the hull. Outside, the city of Shuruppak continues its last, oblivious day under a sky that is beginning to look unwell. The people celebrate their promised shower of riches, unaware that they are living on borrowed time, measured now in heartbeats. For Utnapishtim, this is a silence pregnant with terror, the final pause before the universe is torn apart. He is no longer a king. He is a warden of a floating prison, a zookeeper of ghosts, waiting for the execution of the world. As the first hints of the next dawn touched the horizon, a change began. This was not the familiar, life-affirming glow of the sun god Shamash. This was something else, a strange, sickly luminescence. Then, as Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh, a black cloud began to rise from the very foundation of the sky. It gathered with an unnatural speed, a bruise on the heavens that spread and darkened, swallowing the light. This was the signal. The time for deception was over. The time for annihilation had begun. The first sound was a concussion that shook the very bones of the earth. In the heart of the black cloud, Adad, the god of the storm, began to thunder. This wasn't the distant rumble of a summer storm. This was the roar of a god of war, a relentless, deafening artillery barrage from the heavens. Immediately following his signal, Enlil's two divine heralds, his demonic lieutenants Shulat and Hanish, went forth. They were the vanguard of the apocalypse, storm demons who tore across mountain and land, acting as divine forward observers, calling down the destruction. Then, from the depths of the earth, a different kind of horror was unleashed. Erakul, the god of war and the underworld, the dreaded Nurgle, began to rip out the mooring poles of the world. This is a terrifying, symbolic concept. He wasn't just causing destruction, he was unmaking the structure of reality. The dikes, the canals, the very foundations that held the civilized world together and tethered it to the earth were being torn loose. At the same time, Ninurta, the great warrior of the gods and the lord of irrigation, the very deity who had overseen the digging of the life-giving canals, now passed over the land and made the dikes overflow. The systems of life had been weaponized, turned into instruments of death by their own divine patrons. And then came the light, but it was not the light of hope. The Anunnaki, the 7 dreadful judges of the underworld, rose up and lifted their torches high. It was a terrifying, electrical glare, a strobe of divine fire that set the land ablaze with its awful brightness. Imagine the scene, a world plunged into a darkness so absolute the epic says a brother could not see his brother, punctuated by blinding, terrifying flashes of divine lightning. The storm raged with a fury that was not natural, but personal. It was a coordinated, multi-pronged assault from above and below, a full-scale military operation by the gods against their own creation. The very pillars of heaven trembled. The sound was a symphony of chaos, Adad's unending roar, the crack of the earth's foundations being ripped apart, the hiss of celestial fire, and the overwhelming, deafening rush of water from every direction. The world was being unwritten. It was being returned to the primordial state of watery chaos that existed before creation. And it is here, at the height of their terrible victory, that the Mesopotamian epic delivers its most stunning, most revealing, and most human moment. The gods themselves break. The sheer, untempered violence they have unleashed, the totality of the destruction, horrifies its own creators. They did not fully comprehend what they were doing until they saw it. The text tells us they cowered like dogs, huddling together against the outer wall of the highest heaven, whimpering in fear of the monstrous power they had set in motion. These were not omniscient, all-powerful beings in serene control. They were flawed, terrified architects cowering from the collapse of their own building. The goddess Ishtar, known to the Sumerians as Inanna, the goddess of love and war, the divine embodiment of passion, the great mother goddess, cries out. Her voice, sharp and full of agony, cuts through the din. She shrieks, as the text says, like a woman in childbirth. Her lament is a torrent of grief and regret. How could I have commanded such an evil thing in the council of the gods? She wails. How could I have commanded this war to destroy my people? She had given her vote for this apocalypse, and now, seeing the result, her heart breaks. Her next words are perhaps the most tragic in all of ancient literature. My people, she weeps, have turned to clay. In that single, devastating line, the entire story of creation is inverted. Humanity, which was first fashioned from clay to serve the gods, has now been returned to clay by the gods' own hands. It is the ultimate act of uncreation. The other gods, hearing her cry, weep with her. They sit huddled together, their lips dry and cracked with terror and grief. They had wanted to silence humanity's noise, and in its place they had created a horror that silenced them as well. For 6 days and 7 nights, the wind and the deluge blew and the storm flattened the land. The water rose with an impossible speed, submerging everything. It washed over the cities, the temples, the ziggurats. It rose higher, covering the foothills and then the mountains themselves. The entire world disappeared beneath a single, churning, wrathful ocean. Nothing was left, no landmark, no tree, no life. The world that Utnapishtim had known was gone, erased as if it had never been. Then on the 7th day, the storm began to subside. The wind fell and the sea grew calm. The deluge ceased. Inside his vessel, Utnapishtim would have felt the violent bucking and spinning give way to a gentle, rhythmic rocking. The terrifying noise was replaced by a profound and unnerving quiet. He waited. Then cautiously he opened a hatch and air vent and looked out. The light that fell upon his face was the light of a dead world. Before him there was nothing. No land, no home, no people. Only a flat, placid, featureless expanse of water stretching to every horizon, meeting a sky washed clean of its anger. The epic says the landscape was as level as a rooftop. It was the terrible peace of a graveyard. He looked for the coastline but saw nothing. The boat drifted. He looked again, and he saw that all of humanity had returned to clay. Floating on the surface were the bodies of his people, his neighbors, dissolved and disintegrated by the deluge. He had survived, but he had survived into a world of absolute death. Utnapishtim, the preserver of life, bowed his head and collapsed. The immortal survivor tells Gilgamesh, "I fell to my knees and wept. Tears streamed down my face. He was the loneliest being in all of creation." After the tears, a new state of being began. It was a period of profound limbo, a great and terrible pause in the history of the universe. Utnapishtim's vessel, the preserver of life, drifted aimlessly on a global ocean that had no name and no shore. Inside the ark, there was the fragile sound of life, the breath of his family, the rustle and murmur of the animals. But outside, there was nothing. Only the rhythmic slap of water against the hull and the vast, soul-crushing silence of a dead planet. This was not just a journey across water. It was a journey through a void, a state of suspension between a world that was gone forever and a world that was not yet ready to be born. Every direction was the same. The sun rose and set on an unbroken horizon of water. For Utnapishtim, this was the ultimate test of faith, not in the gods who had just tried to kill him, but in the whisper of the one who had saved him. He was a king with no kingdom, a man with no earth beneath his feet. Then, after 12 days of this aimless drifting, something happened. A jolt, a deep groaning shudder that ran through the entire structure of the boat, followed by a scraping sound that was utterly alien in this world of water. The vessel, which had been in constant, gentle motion, suddenly stopped. It lurched, settled, and then became still, immovably still. After an eternity of chaos and wandering, the ark had made landfall. It had come to rest on the peak of a mountain, the first piece of the old world to break the surface of the new ocean. The epic gives this peak a name, Mount Nisir. The name itself is significant. It means the Mount of Salvation. Its likely location corresponds to the Zagros mountain range in modern-day Iran, a formidable barrier of rock that separates the Mesopotamian plain from the great eastern plateaus. The ark was lodged fast upon its peak. The text is emphatic. Mount Nisir held the boat fast, allowing no motion. After the horror of the storm and the disorienting emptiness of the endless sea, this sudden, rugged stability was the first sign of a new reality. This single mountain peak became the new primordial mound, the first point of creation, an island of hope in a planet-wide sea of death. It was the anchor point for a new world. But Utnapishtim does not throw open the doors in joyous relief. His ordeal has taught him a hard and deep wisdom. He is no longer the trusting king of Shirapak. He is a survivor, a man who has looked into the abyss and seen the caprice of the gods. He knows that this single peak may be a fluke, a temporary anomaly before the waters rise again, and so he waits. He holds his family, the animals, and the seed of civilization in check. He remains sealed inside his vessel, now a mountaintop fortress, for 6 more days. For a full week, he remains lodged on the peak of Mount Nisir, observing, listening, waiting for a sign. This is not an act of fear, but of profound ritual patience. A 7-day storm of destruction is now being balanced by a 7-day vigil of creation. He is allowing the new world to settle into its own rhythm before he dares to set foot upon it. On the morning of the 7th day, Utnapishtim decides it is time to interrogate the world. He needs intelligence. He needs to know if the great recession of the waters has truly begun, or if his mountain is the only land in existence. To do this, he turns to a brilliant, ancient, and deeply practical method of reconnaissance. He will send out scouts, agents who can travel where he cannot, who can read the environment in ways no human can. he will release a series of birds. First, he brings forth a dove, a yana. He opens a hatch, and the bird, a flash of white against the gray desolation, flutters into the open air. The dove is a logical first choice. It's a bird that nests on solid ground, not known for its long-distance seafaring abilities. If there is any land nearby, even a small spit of mud or a newly emerged treetop, the dove will find it. For a time, it circles the Great Arc, this strange new mountain of wood, before heading out over the water. Utnapishtim and his family watch until it is a speck in the distance. They wait. Hours later, the speck reappears. The dove returns to the boat, its mission a failure. As the epic states, it went, but it came back. Because no resting place was visible for it, it turned around. The world was still water. The first test had failed. Utnapishtim is undeterred. He waits, perhaps for another day, allowing the waters to recede further. Then he chooses his second agent. This time, a swallow, a Sinintu. The swallow is a master aviator, faster and with more endurance than the dove. It is an insect hunter, capable of staying on the wing for vast periods, covering much more territory. Its release is a new surge of hope, a dart of iridescent color launched into the emptiness. Two flies out, a living probe sent to measure the habitability of the world. And again, the crew of the Ark waits. The hours stretch on, and again the swallow returns. It went, but it came back. Because no resting place was visible for it, it turned around. The second test had also failed. The silence in the Ark must have been deafening. The hope that had flickered with the grounding on Mount Nisir was now in danger of being extinguished. Was this it? Was this mountain their entire world? A permanent island prison. Now, Utnapishtim comes to his final, most critical choice. He brings forth his third scout, a raven, an Aribu. This choice is a masterstroke of ancient, practical wisdom. The raven is everything the other birds were not. It is large, powerful, and incredibly intelligent. But most importantly, it is an omnivore and an opportunist. It is a scavenger. A dove needs a branch to rest on. A swallow needs insects in the air. But a raven can make a meal of anything. A newly exposed patch of worms in the mud, a rotting fish washed up on a new shoreline, or even the carrion of the creatures that did not survive the flood. The raven does not need a pristine, welcoming environment. It only needs the barest hint of a world returning to life or a world littered with death. Its survival is not dependent on comfort. He releases the great black bird. It launches into the air with powerful wing beats, a stark shape of darkness against the washed-out sky. It circles the Ark once, then flies off with purpose. This time, the waiting is different. This is the final test. If the raven returns, it means the world is truly, utterly barren. There is nothing. But if it does not return, it can only mean one thing. It has found something more compelling than the safety of the Ark. It has found a place to land, and it has found a source of food. Utnapishtim watches and waits. An hour passes. Then another. The sun begins to set. The dove and the swallow had returned. The raven does not. The epic records its success with a series of simple, powerful, declarative verbs. It went, and it saw the abating of the waters. It ate, it circled, it cawed, and it did not come back. Each action is a confirmation. It ate, it found sustenance. It circled, it found a territory to claim. It cawed, the first sound of independent life in the new world, a cry of possession. And the final, definitive proof, it did not come back. The world was no longer a watery grave. It was ready. Life outside the confines of the Ark was once again possible. The raven's silence is the signal. It is the permission slip from a healing world. For Utnapishtim, the long ordeal of imprisonment is over. The door, sealed with the bitumen of survival, is now unbarred. He opens it, and the air that fills the vessel is the air of a world washed clean, sharp, with the scent of wet earth and utter desolation. He then performs the first great act of the new age. He sends forth life. As the epic says, I sent forth everything to the four winds. Imagine the scene, a torrent of life pouring from the great wooden womb, the animals blinking in the strange new sun, taking their first tentative steps onto the muddy peak of Mount Nisir, the sole island of existence. The craftsmen, the keepers of civilization's fire, emerge from the darkness, their skills intact, ready to rebuild a world. But before the work of rebuilding can begin, the work of remembrance and reconnection must be done. Utnapishtim, the priest king, knows that the fragile peace between the human and the divine has been shattered. The covenant of service is broken. He must be the one to re-establish contact, to send a message across the veil to the beings who had just failed to annihilate him. He performs the first religious ritual of the post-Diluvian world. He doesn't just build a simple altar. He arranges cult vessels, 14 of them, in 2 rows of 7. The numerology is deliberate, a sacred equation meant to appease the heavens. And into these vessels, he pours not just animal flesh, but a carefully chosen mixture of fragrant fuel, sweet cane, cedar wood, and myrtle. He is creating a column of smoke, a fragrant offering designed to rise to the heavens and announce that humanity, against all odds, had survived and was ready to resume its duties. The effect is immediate and profound. The text tells us the gods smelled the savor. The gods smelled the sweet savor. For 7 days, while the world drowned, the gods had received no sacrifices. They had received no nourishment from their terrestrial servants. They were starving. And now this irresistible aroma, the scent of prayer and sustenance, reaches them in their celestial abode. And what follows is one of the most shockingly unsentimental, demeaning, and revealing images in all of religious literature. The epic does not say the gods descended like angels or majestic beings. It says, the gods gathered like flies over the sacrifice. This is not a poetic flourish, it's a theological statement. It portrays the divine beings as primal, desperate, driven by a visceral hunger, drawn helplessly to the first sign of their restored food source. The first to arrive is the Queen of Heaven, Ishtar, still incandescent with grief. As she approaches, she sees the scene, the smoking altar, the living humans, and she is overcome. She raises her magnificent necklace, a great strand of deep blue lapis lazuli beads carved in the shape of flies, an ironic echo of the very simile used to describe her colleagues. Lifting this necklace, a gift from her father Anu, she swears a great and terrible oath, her voice ringing across the mountaintop. Gods, as surely as this lapis around my neck I shall not forget, I shall be mindful of these days, and I shall not forget them for all time. Let all the gods come to the sacrifice, she declares, her voice filled with fury, but let not Enlil come to the sacrifice. For he, without reason, brought about the flood and consigned my people to destruction. It is a stunning act of divine defiance. She publicly shames and excommunicates the king of the gods from the first sacred meal of the New World. She draws a line in the cosmic sand, placing the blame for the genocide squarely on Enlil's shoulders. Her words hang in the air just as Enlil himself arrives. He sees the ark, this great impossible structure resting on the mountain, a monument to his failure. And his reaction is not humility. It is not relief. It is pure white-hot rage. His plan for total annihilation has been subverted. He turns on the assembly of the gods, the Ijigi, his voice a venomous hiss. Who has done this? Has some soul escaped? No man was to survive the destruction. He knows there is a traitor in their midst. His perfect, secret crime has a living witness. This is the moment of truth, and the cunning Lord of Wisdom, finally steps out from the shadows. He can no longer hide behind reed walls or clever loopholes. He confronts Enlil directly, and in doing so, delivers one of the most powerful speeches in ancient literature. A rebuke that is simultaneously a defense, a philosophical treatise, and a complete redefinition of divine justice. He begins not with a denial, but with a clever, qualified confession, shifting the blame from his actions to Enlil's lack of wisdom. He says, in essence, it wasn't me who broke the oath. I just sent a dream, a riddle, and this man was wise enough to solve it. Are you angry that he was wise? But then he pivots, moving from defense to offense, and puts Enlil on trial before the entire pantheon. You, the wisest of the gods, the warrior, how could you so senselessly have brought about this flood? E's voice rings with moral authority. He then lays down a revolutionary principle, a concept that would echo through human legal and ethical thought for millennia. On the sinner lay his sin. On the transgressor lay his transgression. In other words, punishment must be proportional and specific. Do not punish the innocent for the crimes of the guilty. Do not burn down a forest to kill a snake. He drives the point home by offering a list of superior, more sensible alternatives. Instead of your bringing on the deluge, he argues, would that a lion had risen up to diminish mankind. Instead of your bringing on the deluge, would that a wolf had risen up to diminish mankind. Instead of a deluge, a famine. Instead of a deluge, the plague god era. He is telling Enlil that his solution was brutish, lazy, and utterly lacking in the divine wisdom he was supposed to embody. It was an act of pure, thoughtless power, not justice. Enlil is struck dumb. He has no response. He has been outmaneuvered, intellectually dismantled, and morally condemned in front of all the other gods. His rage collapses into a kind of sullen acceptance. He has been defeated not by force, but by reason. And now, he must clean up the mess. Utnapishtim and his wife, mere mortals, have survived. They have witnessed the secrets of the gods. They have seen the divine host at their most terrified and flawed. They cannot simply be allowed to go back and rejoin humanity to spread this dangerous knowledge. So Enlil, his fury extinguished, boards the great boat. His demeanor has completely changed. He walks up to Utnapishtim and his wife. He has them kneel before him. Then, performing a solemn ritual of transformation, he touches Utnapishtim's forehead, then his wife's. Standing between them, he makes the final, world-altering pronouncement. Hitherto, Utnapishtim has been but a man, but henceforth Utnapishtim and his wife shall be like us gods. This is the great divine reward. It is the gift of immortality, a prize no human, not even the great Gilgamesh, could ever hope to attain. But this reward is also a sentence. It is a solution born of necessity. Enlil continues, they shall reside far away at the mouth of the rivers. They are granted eternal life, but they are simultaneously exiled from the new world of humanity they have just saved. They are to be sent to Dilmun, a mythical paradise at the edge of the world where the sun rises. Their reward for saving humanity is to be forever separated from it. They will never die, but they will also never again participate in the vibrant, noisy, messy, mortal cycle of life, death, and community. Their immortality is a quarantine. Their paradise is a gilded cage. Utnapishtim's tale, etched in clay and preserved in the silent ruins of Nineveh, eventually fell silent, buried and forgotten for nearly 3 millennia. But the story itself did not die. An archetype this powerful, this resonant with the deep fears and hopes of humanity, does not simply vanish. It echoes, it migrates, it transforms, and it finds new life in new cultures, speaking through new voices. And so, we must now turn our attention eastward and forward in time, to the windswept hills of Canaan, to a different people with a radically different understanding of the cosmos. 1,000 years after the Mesopotamian scribes copied their epic, the Hebrew authors and redactors who compiled the texts of the Torah would tell their own version of the Great Deluge. It is a story that has shaped the Western world, a tale known to billions not from a clay tablet, but from the pages of the book of Genesis. This is the story of Noah. To step into the world of the Noah narrative is to step into a completely different theological universe. The chaotic, vibrant, and deeply flawed pantheon of Mesopotamia is gone. The squabbling, the politicking, the hunger, and the fear of the gods have all vanished. In their place stands a single, unified, transcendent consciousness, a God who is not part of the natural world, but its sole, omnipotent creator. This is Yahweh, and his motivations are not born of irritation or personal inconvenience. They are born of a profound, cosmic sense of moral order and a deep, personal sense of grief over the failure of his own creation. The opening of the Genesis account is sober, solemn, and utterly devastating. The text tells us, "The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time." Here we find the revolutionary pivot upon which this version of the story turns. The crime of humanity is not noise. It is not rigmu, the external clamor of a boisterous population. The crime is internal. It is a corruption of the soul, a moral rot that has infected the very heart of humankind. The key Hebrew word used is hamas, not just violence, but pervasive injustice, corruption. A world where the strong prey on the weak and the social fabric has dissolved into a brutal free-for-all. This is a theological earthquake. The flood is no longer a capricious act of pest control by a grumpy landlord. It is a deliberate, surgical, and sorrowful act of judgment by a righteous creator. The narrative even gives us a window into the divine emotional state, a concept entirely alien to the Mesopotamian version. The text says God regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. This is not the petulant fury of Enlil. This is the profound sorrow of a father for his wayward children. The decision to bring a flood is thus framed not as an act of anger, but as a last resort, an act of uncreation to cleanse the world of a moral cancer that humanity had brought upon itself. And in this world drowning in its own wickedness, God finds one exception. One man, Noah. The text describes him as an Ish-Tzadik Tamim, a righteous and blameless man in his generation. He is not chosen, as Utnapishtim was, simply for being a faithful worshiper of a specific patron god. He is chosen for his absolute moral integrity in a world that had lost its moral compass. The text says Noah walked faithfully with God, implying a deep, personal relationship, a stark contrast to the master-servant dynamic of the Mesopotamian world. The warning Noah receives reflects this new divine character. There is no secrecy, no conspiracy, no need for a cunning loophole like speaking to a reed wall. God communicates with Noah directly, clearly, and authoritatively. It is a divine pronouncement, not a whispered secret. I am going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens, God declares. Everything on earth will perish, but I will establish my covenant with you. This introduces another revolutionary concept, the Berit, or covenant. This is not a mere promise, it is a binding, legal, and relational contract between the divine and the human. Utnapishtim was a survivor of a divine whim. Noah is to be a partner in a divine plan. The instructions for the ark are equally direct and specific, yet different in their very conception. Noah is commanded to build a massive vessel, but it is not a perfect cube. It is to be a long, rectangular chest, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. The proportions are those of a ship. A massive barge designed for stability and capacity, a design far more practical for surviving a long-term flood than Utnapishtim's sacred, symbolic cube. He is told to build it of gopher wood and to seal it with pitch, inside and out. It is to have 3 decks, a door in its side, and a tsohar, a mysterious word that scholars debate means either a window, a roof, or some kind of internal light source. The cargo is also specified with theological precision. Noah is to bring his immediate family, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives, then the animals, 2 of every kind, male and female, to keep them alive. But a second, crucial instruction is added. He is to take 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, and only 1 pair of every unclean animal. This distinction, which is central to later Hebrew ritual law, is projected back into this primordial moment. The plan for survival is already interwoven with a plan for future worship. He is saving not just biology, but the raw materials for a proper relationship with God in the new world. The narrative of the flood unfolds with a solemn, almost geological finality. There are no gods riding the storm or cowering in fear. God is transcendent, above the chaos he has set in motion. On the appointed day, the text says, all the springs of the great deep burst forth and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. It's the same cosmic model as the Mesopotamian universe, water from below and water from above, but it is unleashed by a single, unified, and unwavering will. The rain falls for 40 days and 40 nights, a number that in the Bible almost always signifies a period of trial, testing, and transformation. The central human drama in the Genesis account is not about tricking the gods or surviving their wrath. It is about faith and obedience. Noah's defining characteristic is his unwavering response to God's seemingly insane commands. After every set of divine instructions, the text repeats the simple, powerful refrain: Noah did everything just as God commanded him. He is the archetypal man of faith, who trusts the divine plan even when it means the destruction of his entire world. He is not a tragic hero burdened by a terrible secret. He is a righteous servant, a partner in the grim work of cleansing the earth so that it might begin again, on a new moral foundation. We have now heard 2 epic tales of a world-ending flood, born from 2 different worlds, separated by 1,000 years. On the surface, their theological clothing is profoundly different. One is a chaotic polytheistic drama of flawed, hungry gods. The other is a sober, moralistic monologue from a single, omnipotent deity. But to truly understand what we are looking at, we have to become literary archaeologists. We have to gently brush away the topsoil of theology and look at the hard structure beneath. We need to examine the narrative DNA, the architectural blueprint of the stories themselves. And when we do this, the differences begin to dissolve, revealing a shared skeleton so shockingly identical that it challenges the very notion of coincidence. Let us lay out the evidence, point by point. First, and most fundamentally, the divine decision for a global flood and the warning to a chosen hero. In Mesopotamia, a council of gods, irritated by humanity's noise, decides on total annihilation. In Genesis, a single god, grieved by humanity's wickedness, decides on the same. Despite the wildly different motivations, the premise is identical. The divine sphere resolves to destroy the world with water, but the plan is not absolute. In both narratives, there is a leak. A single human male is chosen to receive a secret, advance warning of the coming apocalypse. Utnapishtim is chosen for his piety to the rebel god E. Noah is chosen for his singular righteousness in a corrupt world. The reasons for their selection differ, but their role is precisely the same: to be the sole human recipient of a world-ending secret and the agent of life's continuation. The story in both cases begins with this act of divine judgment and selective salvation. Second, the specific command to build a great vessel. Neither hero is simply told to run for the hills. Both are given a specific, monumental engineering project. They are commanded to build a boat of unprecedented size. The instructions are detailed and divine in origin. Utnapishtim is given the exact dimensions for a 7-decked cube, a vessel of sacred, symbolic geometry. Noah is given the precise length, width, and height for a massive 3-decked rectangular ark, a vessel of immense practical capacity. Both are told the specific materials to use, wood, and the specific sealant to make it waterproof, bitumen or pitch, the same natural petroleum product. The core narrative beat is identical. The hero must become a divinely inspired shipwright, undertaking a seemingly insane construction project that sets him apart from his doomed society. Third, the preservation of a nucleus of life. The mission is not one of solo survival. In both accounts, the hero is explicitly tasked with creating a floating biosphere, a library of life to carry across the waters of destruction. Utnapishtim is commanded to take his family, his kin, and the seed of all living things. Noah is commanded to take his immediate family, his wife, his sons, and their wives, and the animals, specified in pairs of male and female. Both heroes are charged with preserving not only their own lineage, but the animal kingdom as well. The scope of their mission is identical: to save a representative sample of life on Earth so that the world can be repopulated after the reset. Fourth, the cataclysm itself is global and absolute. Both traditions describe a deluge of unimaginable scope and power. In the Mesopotamian account, a 7-day storm rages with wind and rain, unleashed by a host of gods. In Genesis, the rain falls for 40 days and 40 nights, but the mechanism is the same. It comes from water above and water below, as the springs of the great deep burst forth and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. In both stories, the result is the same: the water overwhelms everything. The land vanishes. The cities are erased. Even the highest mountains are submerged beneath a single global ocean. All terrestrial life not aboard the ark is utterly extinguished. The scale of the destruction is total. Fifth, the ark finds safety on a mountain peak. After the chaos of the storm, as the waters begin to abate, both vessels find their salvation in the exact same way. They come to rest on a mountain. Utnapishtim's boat is lodged fast on the peak of Mount Nisir, in the Zagros range. Noah's ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat, part of the same vast, mountainous region of the ancient Near East. In a world of water, the mountain becomes the first point of contact with a solid, reborn earth. It is the new primordial mound, the bridge between the drowned world and the one to come. The detail of a mountaintop landing is a specific and powerful parallel. Sixth, and perhaps the most startling parallel of all, the reconnaissance by birds. This is the narrative fingerprint that is almost impossible to attribute to chance. How does the hero, isolated on his mountaintop ark, determine if the world is safe to re-enter? Both Utnapishtim and Noah use the exact same methodology. They send out birds as biological drones to survey the drowned landscape. Utnapishtim sends out a dove, which returns. He sends out a swallow, which returns. Finally, he sends out a raven, which finds sustenance and does not return. Noah sends out a raven, which flies to and fro, and then sends out a dove 3 times. The first time it returns. The second time it returns with a freshly plucked olive leaf, a sign of new life. The third time it does not return. Though the specific birds in their order show minor variations, the core methodology, the sequential release of birds from the ark to test for habitable land, culminating in a bird's non-return as the definitive signal to disembark, is identical. This is not a broad archetype. This is a specific, peculiar, and highly complex plot point shared by both traditions. And finally, 7. The hero's first act is a sacrifice. Upon exiting the ark and setting foot on the clean, empty earth, what is the first thing both heroes do? They build an altar and make a sacrifice to the divine. Utnapishtim's offering of cane, cedar, and myrtle sends up a sweet savor that attracts the hungry gods like flies. Noah builds an altar and offers burnt offerings from the clean animals, and the Lord smells the pleasing aroma. In both narratives, the very first act of the New World is a ritual act of worship. A burnt offering whose scent travels to the heavens and reestablishes the relationship between humanity and the divine. 7 points of contact. 7 shared pillars of narrative architecture. A divine decision for a flood, a warning to a chosen hero, a command to build a great boat. The salvation of family and animals, a world-ending deluge, a landing on a mountain, and reconnaissance by birds, followed by a sacrifice. When you lay the bones of the stories side by side, stripping them of their theological flesh, you are not looking at 2 different stories. You are looking at 2 versions of the same story, told 1,000 years apart. The question then is not if they are related. The question is how. If the uncanny similarities in plot are what first draw us into this mystery, it is the profound, seismic differences in meaning that ultimately reveal its true significance. For a story is not merely a sequence of events, it is a vessel for a worldview. And while the Mesopotamian and Hebrew scribes may have worked from the same ancient blueprint, the edifices they built were designed to house 2 entirely different gods and 2 entirely different conceptions of humanity. To move from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the Book of Genesis is to witness a theological revolution in slow motion. It is to see a myth being deliberately dismantled and reassembled to answer a new and more profound set of questions. Let us begin with the most fundamental difference of all, the nature of the divine. The Mesopotamian flood story unfolds in a world run by a committee. The divine is a pantheon, a chaotic and dysfunctional celestial bureaucracy populated by gods with distinct personalities, limited domains, and all too human flaws. They are powerful, yes, but they are not all powerful. They scheme, they argue, they fear, and they regret. Enlil, the instigator of the flood, is not an absolute monarch. He is a powerful executive who can be defied by a clever subordinate like E. And most tellingly, when the storm they unleash reaches its full, terrifying potential, they are not transcendent masters of the chaos. They are horrified by it. They cower like dogs, weeping and whimpering, overwhelmed by the consequences of their own rash decision. This is a universe where power is fragmented, and even the gods are subject to the terror of cosmic forces. Now, contrast this with the God of Genesis. Here, the divine council has been dissolved. There is only one will, one voice, one singular consciousness that authors, executes, and oversees the entire event. Yahweh acts alone. There is no one to persuade, no one to deceive, no one to defy. His power is absolute, and his knowledge is total. He does not cower from the flood. He commands it with a sublime and terrifying authority. Where the Mesopotamian gods feel a panicked, self-interested fear, the God of Genesis feels a deep, sorrowful, and majestic grief for the world he must uncreate. This is not the panicked reaction of a flawed deity. It is the deliberate, controlled sorrow of an omnipotent judge. The shift from a polytheistic soap opera to a monotheistic monologue changes the entire moral and philosophical gravity of the story. This fundamental difference in the nature of the divine leads directly to the second great chasm between the two tales, the reason for the flood. As we've seen, the rationale for the Mesopotamian flood is to our modern ears shockingly trivial. Humanity's crime was noise. Their vitality, their very existence, had become an annoyance to a god who wanted to sleep. This reveals a world in which humanity's value is purely functional. We were created to be quiet servants, and when we ceased to be quiet, we became disposable. The flood is, in essence, a cosmic noise complaint, a genocidal act of pest control. It has no moral dimension. The book of Genesis discards this rationale completely and replaces it with something revolutionary. The problem is not humanity's noise, it is humanity's choices. The key word is hamas, violence, corruption, injustice. The world is destroyed not because it is loud, but because it is evil. This reframes the entire human condition. We are no longer merely servants whose function is to be quiet. We are moral agents, endowed with free will, and we are held accountable for how we use it. The flood in Genesis is a direct consequence of human moral failure. This elevates the stakes of human existence beyond anything the Mesopotamians imagined. Our actions have cosmic significance. We can, through our choices, corrupt the very fabric of creation and grieve the heart of God. This is a universe governed by an ethical framework, not by the whims of divine pet peeves. Finally, these two divergent paths, the nature of the divine and the reason for the flood, lead to two completely different destinations, the outcome for the hero and the world. Utnapishtim's story ends with a reward that is intensely personal and ultimately isolating. For his service, he and his wife are granted the ultimate upgrade. They are deified. They are made immortal like the gods. But this gift is also a sentence. They are immediately exiled from the world of men, sent to live far away at the mouth of the rivers. They escape death, but they also escape humanity. They become living relics, forever separated from the cycle of life, family, and community that they fought so hard to preserve. And crucially, the fundamental relationship between the gods and the rest of humanity remains unchanged. The gods are still capricious, humanity is still vulnerable, and there is no guarantee that the whole terrible cycle won't happen again. The conclusion of Noah's story could not be more different. His reward is not personal, it is universal. It is not an escape from humanity, it is a promise for all of humanity and indeed for all of life. Noah receives a covenant. God makes a binding, eternal promise not just to Noah, but to all living creatures of every kind on the earth. He vows, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans," even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. "And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done." To seal this unbreakable promise, God sets a sign in the clouds. The rainbow, which in Mesopotamia was the menacing warbow of the goddess Ishtar, is here transformed into a symbol of peace and divine memory. It is God hanging up his weapon of war, a celestial reminder of his vow to never again wage war on the world with water. The story ends not with one man becoming a god, but with God establishing a new, stable, and predictable relationship with the entire world. It is a story that moves from judgment to promise, from destruction to reconciliation. So while the narrative bones are the same, the souls of the stories are worlds apart. The Hebrew authors were not simply copying a popular tale. They were engaging in a profound act of theological polemics. They took a story about chaotic, immoral gods and a world subject to divine whim, and they deliberately reframed it into a foundational epic about a single moral God, about a humanity that is accountable for its actions, and about a universe that is ultimately governed not by chaos, but by covenant. The connection between the Mesopotamian story and the biblical story is so profound, so textually specific, that it practically screams of a direct line of cultural inheritance. But to stop there is to miss the forest for two very important trees. For the story of a great flood is not merely a regional phenomenon of the ancient Near East. It is a psychic scar that marks the body of our entire species. Once you begin to look for it, you see it everywhere. It is a persistent echo that resounds across continents and oceans, whispered in languages that have never met, by cultures that have never touched. It is a ghost in our collective machine, a foundational myth that humanity, for some deep and mysterious reason, felt compelled to tell over and over and over again. Let us leave the Fertile Crescent and travel eastward to the Indian subcontinent. Here, in the ancient Sanskrit texts of the Shatapatha Brahmana and the later Puranas, we find the story of a man named Manu. He is the progenitor of humanity, a figure of great wisdom. One day, while washing his hands in a river, a tiny fish swims into his palms and speaks. The fish, named Matsya, begs for protection from the larger fish in the river. Manu, moved by compassion, places the fish in a small jar, but the fish quickly outgrows it. He moves it to a pond, then a lake, then the mighty Ganges River, and finally to the ocean itself. Each time, the fish grows to fill its new home. Finally, this colossal, golden fish reveals its true identity. It is an avatar of the great god Vishnu, the preserver of the universe, and he has come with a warning. A devastating flood, a pralaya, is coming that will dissolve the entire cosmos. Vishnu instructs Manu to build a great ship and to load onto it his family, the 7 primordial sages known as the Saptarishi, and the seeds of every plant and every animal. When the deluge comes, Manu tethers his ship to the great horn on the fish's head, and Vishnu himself guides the vessel safely through the cosmic waters, finally lodging it on a high peak in the Himalayas. From there, Manu performs a sacrifice, and from that offering, a new human family is born. The parallels are staggering. A divine warning, a chosen hero, the command to build a great boat, the preservation of sages, seeds, and animals, and the final landing on a mountaintop. Yet the flavor is uniquely Indian, a story of cosmic cycles and divine compassion rather than divine anger. Now let us turn west, to the heart of the classical world, to the mountains of Greece. Here, the great Roman poet Ovid tells us the story of Deucalion and his wife, Pyrrha. The king of the gods, Zeus, disgusted by the impiety and wickedness of humanity, epitomized by a cannibalistic king named Lycaon, decides to wash the world clean with water. But the Titan Prometheus, the creator and defender of humanity, learns of the plan. He secretly warns his own son, the righteous Deucalion. Following his father's advice, Deucalion builds a wooden chest, an ark, and boards it with his wife just as Zeus unleashes the deluge. For 9 days and 9 nights, they are tossed upon a limitless sea that has swallowed all of Greece. Finally, their chest comes to rest on the misty peaks of Mount Parnassus. Alone in a silent world, they pray to the goddess Themis for guidance on how to restore the human race. The goddess answers with a cryptic riddle: veil your heads and cast behind you the bones of your great mother. Pyrrha is horrified, but the wise Deucalion correctly interprets the oracle. The great mother is Gaia, the earth herself, and her bones are the stones of the land. And so they walk down the mountain, tossing stones over their shoulders. The stones thrown by Deucalion magically transform into men. Those thrown by Pyrrha transform into women. Once again, the core structure is there: divine anger at human wickedness, a chosen, righteous hero who is warned, the building of a vessel of salvation, a world-ending flood, and a landing on a specific mountain. The pattern is undeniable, but perhaps these cultures, Near Eastern, Indian, Greek, were all connected through ancient trade routes and the slow diffusion of ideas. To prove the truly global nature of this myth, we must travel further, to worlds that had no contact with the old one. Let us cross the ocean to the Americas. Among the Anishinaabe people of the Great Lakes region, we hear the story of Waynaboozhoo. The creator, Jichimanadu, sees that his human children have become disrespectful and corrupt. He decides to purify the earth with water. He warns the hero Waynaboozhoo, who builds a great raft and gathers upon it his family and pairs of all the animals. The rains come and the world is submerged. For a long time, they float upon the endless water, searching for any sign of land. Waynaboozhoo then begins his own form of reconnaissance. He sends a loon to dive deep, but it finds nothing. He sends a beaver, but it too fails. Finally, a humble muskrat volunteers for the impossible task. It dives, staying below for a dangerously long time. It finally floats to the surface, dead from the effort, but clutched tightly in its tiny paw is a small speck of mud. Buju takes this precious bit of earth, places it on the back of a great turtle who has also survived, and he breathes life into it. The earth begins to magically grow and expand, spreading out from the turtle's back until it becomes the new land, a continent that is still known to many indigenous peoples as Turtle Island. What are we to make of this? How can cultures, separated by thousands of miles of ocean and thousands of years of history, all tell a story with the same fundamental grammar? The explanations are as vast and deep as the mythical floodwaters themselves. Some believe these stories are the faint, distorted echoes of a real, historical cataclysm, perhaps the end of the last ice age, some 12,000 years ago. As the great continental glaciers melted, sea levels rose dramatically, inundating coastal plains and continental shelves where early humans lived. Events like the sudden flooding of the Persian Gulf or the catastrophic breaching of the Bosporus, which created the Black Sea, would have been apocalyptic, world-ending events for the people who witnessed them. Perhaps the survivors carried this traumatic memory with them as they migrated across the globe, the story changing and adapting to new landscapes and new gods, but always retaining its core of terror and survival. Or perhaps the answer is not historical, but psychological. Perhaps the flood myth is not a memory of an event that happened in the outer world, but an archetypal map of a process that happens in our inner world. Carl Jung and his followers would argue that water is a universal symbol of the unconscious, of chaos, of the dissolution of form. The flood, then, is a psychic crisis, a moment when the established order of the ego is overwhelmed and dissolved, a necessary death for a spiritual rebirth. The ark becomes the vessel of consciousness, the core of the self that preserves the essential elements of our identity, while the old world of our certainties is washed away. The landing on the mountain is the emergence of a new, higher level of awareness. In this view, we don't remember the flood because our ancestors saw it. We remember it because, at some point in our lives, we all experience it. Ultimately, there may be no single answer. The power of the great flood myth may lie precisely in this duality, that it resonates as both a plausible, forgotten history and as a timeless, personal, psychological truth. It is the story of our planet's geological volatility and our own psychic fragility. It is the ultimate story of crisis and renewal, of catastrophe and hope. It is the story we tell ourselves to remember that while the world can end, it can also, through the actions of a chosen few, begin again. Having established that these two stories, Mesopotamian and Hebrew, share an identical narrative skeleton, and having explored how their theological hearts beat to entirely different rhythms, we arrive at the final, critical question: how? How is this possible? Is it a case of two cultures independently dreaming up the same myth, or is it something more direct, more intimate? The answer to that question isn't found in ancient myth, but in a thrilling, real-life detective story from the 19th century, a story of forgotten empires, inscrutable texts, and a single brilliant discovery that would shake the foundations of the Western world. For most of Western history, there was no debate. The story of Noah's Ark, as told in the book of Genesis, stood alone. It was considered a unique and sacred account, a divinely revealed piece of history. The idea that it could have a predecessor, a pagan forerunner, was simply beyond the conceptual horizon. That all changed in the mid-19th century. As the great European powers raced to excavate the mysterious mounds of Mesopotamia, vast libraries of clay tablets, inscribed with the forgotten wedge-shaped script of cuneiform, began flooding into the museums of London, Paris, and Berlin. For the first time in 2,000 years, the voices of Assyria and Babylon began to speak again. But it required a new kind of priest to interpret their secrets, the Assyriologist. Into this world stepped a man named George Smith. He was not a privileged university academic. He was a working-class Londoner, a brilliant, self-taught engraver who became obsessed with the cuneiform tablets at the British Museum. He possessed a rare genius for the work, an almost intuitive ability to recognize patterns and piece together shattered fragments of clay. In November of 1872, while sorting through a collection of tablets recovered from the ruins of the great library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, Smith's eyes fell upon a sequence of lines. As he pieced the broken tablet together, his excitement grew to a fever pitch. The fragment described a great boat coming to rest on the mountains of Nisir, and a hero sending out a dove, then a swallow, then a raven to find dry land. Smith, steeped in the Bible, understood the earth-shattering significance of what he was holding. He had found an account of the Great Flood, written in a language far older than Hebrew, from a civilization that had crumbled to dust long before the final compilation of the Bible. The story goes that in the moment of his discovery, he was so overcome with excitement that he leaped to his feet and, to the astonishment of his colleagues, began to remove his own clothes. Whether true or not, the image captures the sheer explosive force of the revelation. On December 3rd of that same year, Smith presented his findings to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London. The room was packed. The Prime Minister himself, William Gladstone, was in attendance. When Smith announced that he had discovered a pagan version of Noah's story that predated the Bible by at least 1,000 years, it was a bombshell. The discovery ignited a firestorm of controversy across Europe and America, a fierce public debate that became known as the Babel und Bibel, or Babel and Bible controversy. The implications were terrifying to many. For centuries, the Bible's authority had rested on its perceived uniqueness and divine origin. Now, here was concrete archaeological proof that one of its most foundational stories had a clear precedent in the mythology of a polytheistic empire. Was Genesis not history, but literature? Was it not a direct revelation from God, but a Hebrew adaptation of a common Mesopotamian folktale? The debate raged, forcing a radical reevaluation of the Bible's place in the ancient world. In the century and a half since Smith's discovery, the academic dust has settled, and a clear scholarly consensus has emerged, reinforced by even more discoveries. Smith's tablet was just one piece of the puzzle. We now know of even older versions of the story, such as the fragmentary Sumerian account of a king named Ziusudra, and most importantly, the magnificent Old Babylonian Epic of Atrahasis. The Atrahasis epic, dating to around 1700 BCE, is particularly crucial because it presents both a creation story and a flood story in a single narrative, much like the opening chapters of Genesis. It became clear that the flood myth was not an obscure tale, but a central, evolving, and incredibly ancient part of Mesopotamian literary tradition for millennia. So, how did this story make the journey from the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates to the pages of the Hebrew Bible? The mechanism of transmission was the immense cultural gravity of Mesopotamia itself. For nearly 3,000 years, Mesopotamia was the superpower of the region. Its languages, its laws, its science, and its stories radiated outwards, influencing every culture they touched. But scholars now believe the most direct and intense period of transmission occurred during one of the most traumatic events in Jewish history, the Babylonian exile. In the 6th century BCE, the kingdom of Judah was conquered by the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Judean elite, the priests, the scribes, the artisans, the very people who were writing and compiling the biblical texts, were forcibly marched to Babylon. For the better part of a century, the intellectual heart of the Jewish people lived and worked immersed in the dominant, powerful culture of their captors. It was here that they would have encountered the great Babylonian myths, not as foreign curiosities, but as the state-sponsored epics of the empire. They would have heard the story of Utnapishtim and the Great Flood. Modern scholars no longer use crude terms like copying or plagiarism. To do so misses the genius of what the Hebrew scribes accomplished. They were engaged in a profound and sophisticated act of cultural appropriation and creative transformation. They took the familiar narrative framework of the flood story, a structure their audience, living in a Babylonian-dominated world, would have recognized, and they used that framework to mount a powerful critique of Babylonian theology itself. It was a form of cultural resistance. They were, in essence, saying to the empire that held them captive, "Your foundational story is about petty, fearful gods who destroy the world out of annoyance. We will now tell you the true story. The true story is about one all-powerful moral God who acts not out of irritation, but out of a grief for the wickedness of humankind. Your hero is saved by a trick. Our hero is saved by his faith. Your story ends with an arbitrary reward for one man. Our story ends with a universal promise for all of creation. The Genesis account is thus a polemic, a counter-myth. It hijacks the structure of a pagan story to assert a monotheistic worldview. It was a radical act of saying, our God is not like your gods. The Bible, we now understand, was not written in a sacred vacuum. It was born in a messy, interconnected world, forged in the fires of national tragedy and exile, and written in direct dialogue with the great civilizations that surrounded it. Recognizing this doesn't diminish its power. It reveals the true depth of its revolutionary message and the audacious genius of its authors. So now we arrive at the heart of the matter. After this long journey through drowned worlds, divine conspiracies, and forgotten languages, what is the real secret we have managed to unearth? The temptation is to give a simple answer, that the story of Noah's Ark was copied from an older pagan myth, but that's not the secret. That is merely the headline, the shocking surface-level fact that shattered the comfortable assumptions of the 19th century. The true secret, the one that has unfolded in the quiet halls of academia for the last 150 years, is far more subtle, more complex, and infinitely more profound. The real secret is not what the Bible borrowed, but what that act of borrowing reveals about the Bible itself, about the nature of history, and about the very definition of sacredness. For most of Western history, the Hebrew Bible was treated as a book outside of time. It was seen as existing in a kind of splendid, sacred isolation, a direct and unmediated monologue from God to his chosen people. Its stories were unique, its laws were absolute, its truth was self-contained. The discovery of the Mesopotamian flood myths, particularly the Epic of Gilgamesh, shattered that isolation forever. It was like discovering that a lone, mysterious mountain you believed to be singular was actually the highest peak of a vast, submerged mountain range. The discovery doesn't diminish the mountain's height, but it fundamentally changes your understanding of its origin and its place in the world. The secret, then, is about context. It's the revelation that the Bible was not written in a divine vacuum. Its authors were not scribes sitting in a silent room taking dictation from the heavens. They were real people, living in a real, messy, and interconnected world. They were breathing the same cultural air as their neighbors in Babylon, Egypt, and Canaan. They knew their stories, they understood their symbols, and they wrestled with their ideas. The Bible, we now understand, is a product of this great ancient conversation. It is one powerful voice in a chorus of other powerful voices, and its message can only be fully understood when you can also hear the echoes of the songs it was singing along with and singing against. This realization, far from diminishing the authors of Genesis, should fill us with a new sense of awe for their genius. The secret is not that they were copyists, but that they were masters of cultural judo. They took the foundational epic of the world's reigning superpower, a story that reinforced the Babylonian worldview of chaotic, amoral gods and a servile, insignificant humanity, and they turned it on its head. They hijacked the most popular story in the ancient world and re-engineered it into a vehicle for their own radical, countercultural, monotheistic vision. Think of the audacity of that act. It is a work of profound literary and spiritual rebellion. It's as if a small, occupied nation today were to take the biggest blockbuster film from the empire that occupies them and recut it to tell a story that fundamentally critiques and subverts the empire's own values. This is not plagiarism. This is polemics. This is a battle for the soul of the world, fought with ink and clay instead of swords and shields. The significance of The Secret is that it allows us to see the authors of Genesis not as passive receivers of tradition, but as active, brilliant innovators who forged their nation's identity by engaging with and ultimately transforming the dominant myths of their time. Furthermore, this discovery humanizes the sacred text in a way that can be deeply illuminating. When we see the Bible as a text in dialogue with its surroundings, we can begin to see the human hands that shaped it, the human minds that wrestled with its meaning. We can almost feel the anxieties of those scribes living in exile in Babylon, surrounded by the towering ziggurats and the magnificent idols of Marduk. How do you maintain your faith in a singular, invisible God when you are a captive in a land that celebrates a vast and glorious pantheon? You do it by telling a better story. You do it by asserting that the true history of the world is not the one your captors believe, but the one that your God has revealed to you. The Bible becomes not a flat, static document that fell from the sky, but a dynamic, three-dimensional testament to a people's struggle to find meaning, to maintain hope, and to assert their unique relationship with the divine in the face of overwhelming cultural pressure. Finally, the secret challenges us to rethink our rigid categories of myth and history. The story of Utnapishtim is clearly mythological. For centuries, the story of Noah was presented as literal history. The discovery of their shared DNA reveals that they are both powerful expressions of the same deep, archetypal myth. It forces us to recognize that the Bible is not a history book in the modern journalistic sense. It is a work of theological history. Its purpose is not merely to record what happened, but to interpret what happened, whether real or mythical, to reveal a deeper truth about the nature of God and the meaning of human existence. The truth of the Genesis flood story, therefore, may not lie in the precise dimensions of the ark or the historical reality of a global deluge. Its truth lies in its message, that the universe is governed by a moral order, that human actions have consequences, and that even after the most terrible judgment, there is the possibility of a new beginning, guaranteed by a divine promise. So the ultimate secret is this: the story of the flood is far older and more widespread than we ever imagined. But the genius of the biblical authors was to take that common clay of ancient myth and fire it in the kiln of their own unique faith, creating something new, durable, and revolutionary. Unearthing this secret doesn't have to be a crisis of faith. Instead, it can be an invitation to a more mature, more nuanced, and ultimately more profound appreciation of these ancient texts. It pulls back the curtain, not to show that the wizard is a fraud, but to reveal the incredible, human-powered and historically grounded machinery that has made these stories resonate with such power for thousands of years. And so our journey through the drowned worlds of the past comes to a close. We began with a familiar story, etched into the bedrock of Western consciousness, and traveled back through time to its older, wilder, and more chaotic ancestor, a tale not of one god, but of many, a tale of survival not as a reward for righteousness, but as the outcome of a divine, secret rebellion. We saw how this deep, primordial story refused to stay buried, echoing not just in the Levant, but in the myths of India, Greece, and across the oceans to the Americas, a testament to its profound grip on the human imagination. What we have uncovered is that these stories are not static monoliths of truth, but living, breathing streams of tradition that flow through civilizations, carving new channels and taking on the color of the soil they pass through. To learn that the story of Noah has roots in the Epic of Gilgamesh is not to diminish the Bible. Rather, it is to place it back into its proper, magnificent context, as a brilliant and audacious response to the great narratives of its age. The secret we unearthed is not one of theft, but of transformation. It reveals the true genius of the biblical authors, who forged a revolutionary theology of hope, morality, and covenant from the common clay of ancient myth. But this journey through the past ultimately leads us back to the present and to a question for you. For these stories only have power if we continue to engage with them. Now that you have seen the older blueprint, does it change how you view the story of Noah? Does it challenge your understanding, strengthen it, or simply enrich it by adding layers of depth and history you never knew existed? What to you is the most powerful difference? The motive for the flood, the character of the gods, or the ultimate fate of the hero? Share your perspective in the comments below. This is a conversation thousands of years in the making, and we want to hear your voice. If this exploration has shed new light on these ancient mysteries, help us share that illumination with others by liking this video and sharing it with anyone who seeks a deeper understanding of our shared past. And to ensure you don't miss our next investigation into the lost chapters of human history, be sure to subscribe to our channel and activate notifications. Our work uncovering these echoes has only just begun. Thank you for joining us on this journey.